spring came early. The troops were able to cope with the winter hardships at a great cost. The soldiers who fought on the front lines were at the limit of their physical capabilities, but they endured and proved their ability to meet such challenges with dignity. On our operating table, we heard an incredible number of curses, but we never heard a complaint. The morale of the troops was quite extraordinary. The troops had been spoilt by years of victories. The current defeat could be blamed on the mistakes of the High Command. This was quite clear to any soldier. It made the men much more perceptive. To put it in their plain language, it sounded something like, "Okay, they made a mistake, and we pulled them out of the mud." This reflected the real feelings of the people towards their rulers, whom they had no other way to complain about. Such an attitude on the part of the soldiers was misunderstood by the authorities. The dictator who stood at the head of the state knew as much about Prussian discipline as a Congolese witch doctor knows about science. He did not realize that orders given in a moment of crisis or catastrophe, which make the impossible possible, are obeyed simply because they are orders. They were ill-conceived and spontaneous. He had fallen into the delusion of assuring himself that he simply had to give orders, and whatever he wished would come true. The soldier gave him a real chance. Then this exceptional achievement in exceptional circumstances was accepted as the norm. But the impossible, of course, remains impossible. And such orders are just figments of a sick imagination. With some pathetic aplomb, the dictator assumed the duties of Supreme Commander-in-Chief. At first it seemed a sensible and successful decision. It gave the impression that he was taking responsibility for the defeat personally. But he overlooked the fact that the soldier is essentially a sober realist. By this act, he caused distrust in the troops to the people who were responsible for making the most important decisions that determined the course of the war. At the same time, there was a surge of young staff officers who loudly proclaimed themselves adherents of the party, regardless of whether this was their sincere conviction or mere calculation. These determined and ambitious men realized that they were departing from long-established army traditions, but they were quickly able to assuage their consciences. If anyone became a follower of this completely inhumane system, their worldview was completely changed. Mass murder of Soviet citizens was justified by political expediency, and revenge became a right. This shift in moral reference points can be medically defined as a symptom of psychosis. A small number of these officers, selected not for their abilities, but only for their political convictions, soon donned the gold-studded tunic of military commanders. In the final stages of the war, it was generals of this type who, by their paranoid claims to success and power, contributed in no small measure to creating a climate of hysteria at the highest levels. There was one other thing they overlooked. It may seem rather strange, but we never gave much thought to the anger that our invasion of their country might arouse in the Russians. All the Russians we had to deal with seemed nice enough people. The population clearly expressed no hostility. Most of the powers, however, expressed a desire to fight against the Soviets, but as the war progressed, the Soviet leaders were able to exploit the idea of patriotism successfully, and their most effective arguments were based on criticism of the enemy's behavior. For every Russian, any German was a representative of a system that was hostile to him. After all, the Germans were fighting for it. This is undoubtedly one of the reasons why the Russians committed so many atrocities. All this, in turn, was used for propaganda purposes. The little man at the head of the Ministry of Propaganda believed that if you convince a German soldier that if he surrendered he would certainly be killed, he would fight to his last breath. However, this was not entirely true. All sorts of things happened. Many prisoners were actually killed, but the soldier drew a different conclusion from all the propaganda. He fought to the last possible opportunity. In fact, that meant that he fought as long as he had a chance to withdraw. He could make his own decision. The decision was often determined by a constant sense of anxiety. A soldier may show marvelous bravery, but he has no desire to commit suicide. Thus, there was a clear error in the calculations of the High Command. At its core, everything seemed to make sense. The system was sustained only by violence, and it could maintain its existence only by violence. It cannot be said that it was possible to avoid all the mistakes made during the war, but it can be said with certainty that they were all the product of that system. It took a certain amount of time for the results of these mistakes to become apparent. At first all went well. Theodosia was repulsed. The Russians were again driven from the Kerch Peninsula, only deep underground, in the abandoned quarries, which stretched for many kilometers under Kerch. There were still pockets of their resistance. There they held on for 2 years, until the spring of 1944 when Crimea was finally lost to us. The tenacity of these men is to be admired, although at that time the Russians probably despaired at the sight of the renewed strength of the German forces. They again turned to flight. When the offensive into the Caucasus began, the feeling of fatalism inherent in the East again prevailed, and whole regiments began to surrender. There was no doubt that it was mainly only Soviet political commissars and political instructors who kept the troops in the will to resist. The dictator also realized this. He decided to introduce the institution of political leaders in the German army as well. But in doing so, he destroyed the Prussian discipline, with the help of which he was able to win all the previous victories. And he probably also forgot that in 1 year of war, he would not be able to create the type of man that the Russians had managed to create in the 20 years that had passed since the revolution. During the attack on the Russian positions at Vladislavovka, with which the new offensive on the Kerch Peninsula began, we opened a field surgical hospital in a small village called Petrovka. Because of bad weather, the attack was postponed several times. Although it was already spring, there were heavy downpours from time to time, and we had all now become major experts on the thaw. We did not want to get bogged down in mud a second time because of it. The tank division, which had just arrived from the Western Front, took part in a battle reconnaissance conducted in a limited area. The tankers were well equipped. They even had winter uniforms, and they looked with some contempt at our worn-out infantrymen. They set about their tasks with gusto, but soon got stuck in mud that they had never had to deal with before. Many tanks sank in the mud and had to be pulled out by tractor-trailers, after which they were sent to the rear for overhaul, and only then were they able to take part in the fighting again. The infantrymen called the tankers cologne-scented guys and characterized them with the following words. They came straight from home and disappeared into the clear air. An order was issued forbidding this. It is clear that in this way, even those who had not heard it before now became aware of it. In Petrovka, we carried out operations in shifts of 44 hours, starting at 4 a.m. and finishing at 11 a.m. every other day. One can only sustain such exertion under certain conditions: good food, determination, and large portions of coffee. If one takes even one sip of vodka in such a state, anyone will fall off their feet as if they had taken a fair share of alcohol. During the French campaign, one of the surgeons in our field hospital was wounded in the leg below the knee, and then had paralysis of some of his muscles, his leg swelling so much that his boot had to be cut open. With such excessive exertion, one's strength gradually runs out. Just as in a marathon race, there seems to be complete physical exhaustion after 36 hours of labor, but then a second breath opens up. The flow of wounded has dried up. I lay down to rest, but it is simply impossible to sleep under such conditions. I remember my bed. The mattress rested on water tanks. The advantage of such a construction was that the rats did not run constantly over the sleeper. The rats also accustomed us to sleep wrapped up with our heads in a blanket. After an indeterminate amount of time, it turned out that only an hour had passed. Our commander came into the room. Come on, get up. 2 wounded men arrived with bullet wounds to the lungs. With a "I don't care anymore" motion, I rolled over onto my other side. Suddenly I heard a stern voice. I order you to get up and continue operating. Still in a half-asleep state, I rolled over onto my other side. Then a series of thoughts flashed through my sleepy brain. Official orders, refusal to obey, defiant behavior towards a superior officer, court. All this could have awakened anyone from the deepest slumber. However, I could not conquer my fatigue. I struggled and failed. At first nothing happened. Suddenly someone sat on the bed. Someone sat on its edge. Someone's hand lay on my arm. At the same moment a stern voice spoke again. Be good. Get up. I would not like to punish you. After these words I stood up, but it took another 10 minutes until my bones were able to support the weight of my body. When the proverbial 44 hours were up, it was 0 in the morning. I crawled out of the operating theatre. The sun was shining. A few dry patches were already peeking through on the village street. A soft, warm breeze was blowing. A lonely birch tree stood between 2 houses, and the first tender leaves began to appear on its branches. The war continued, and the offensive was successful. I pondered the situation. My condition did not permit me to admit a single patient. I only remembered that I performed countless operations involving lung wounds, since we had no transport problems. We were able to send patients directly to the divisional field hospital in doubtful cases, and in return they would send us all patients who had suffered lung wounds. As I squinted in the sunlight, I saw Sergeant Herman, the old RTU, heading towards me. It was his duty to tend to the most seriously wounded. As he walked, I was beginning to worry if something serious had happened, so I asked him, "Herman, how many patients with lung wounds were there today?" "No, 24. How many of them are still alive?" Sergeant Herman paused for a moment. Then he smiled and said, "Oh, all of them." The sunshine smiled. The birch tree smiled too. If you sort it out, surgery is a wonderful. Accompanied by Herman, I walked between the houses. When we entered one of them, where patients with lung wounds were lying, I asked them if they had any requests, and someone cautiously asked, "How about a cigarette, doctor?" We transferred the field surgical hospital to a factory building located on the shore of the Black Sea, just a few kilometers east of Feodosia. For a while the flow of wounded dried up. We caught some small sardine-like fish in the calm water and fried them right out in the open. During one of the operations we had occasionally at that time, Sergeant Herman came in and said with a grin, "The Russians have set fire to the fuel depot." "What Russians?" "The 2 wounded men you operated on just an hour ago." I completed the operation and, intrigued by this message, went out into the courtyard. One of the Russians had a light wound to the forearm. His arm was hanging from a sling. Another of these Russians had his arm broken by shrapnel just above the elbow. We enclosed it in a wire frame, in which the arm could lie safely in a horizontal position. In this position, the bone would heal faster. The fire was still smouldering in a corner of the courtyard. Corporal Votruba acted as interpreter. I briefly questioned the prisoners. "Were you the ones who set fire to the fuel depot?" "Yes." "Why?" The soldiers shrugged their shoulders in bewilderment. "Were you treated well?" "Yes." "Were you fed?" "Yes." "Were you given cigarettes?" At this time they stood with smoking cigarettes in their hands. In order to set fire to the fuel depot, they used the matches they had been given to light the cigarettes. Probably one of them was holding a matchbook and the other was striking a match at the same time. The whole story was a mystery. After all that was done, they didn't even try to escape. "Were you mistreated when you were taken prisoner?" "No." "Do you realize you've committed an act of sabotage?" The word sabotage usually made an intimidating impression on the Russians. "Do you know what the penalty is for an act of sabotage?" "Yes." "What is it?" "Death." When they said it, they showed no sign of agitation. "What part of Russia are you from?" "We were Dupeks." "So they're from Central Asia. You know you're going to be shot?" "Yes." "Why did you do it?" No answer. "Are you members of the Communist Party?" No. They hardly knew who Stalin was at all. They were so poorly versed in politics that it hardly made sense to doubt their answers. We called in an expert. It was a corporal from our company, about whom everyone knew that he was a major anti-communist, but even he could not make a final judgment. We were more soldiers than medics. It was impossible to find a body of military law in the whole world that provided for any punishment other than death for an act of sabotage in a military zone. Gradually, more and more soldiers from our company began to gather around. Sergeant Fash, the anesthetist, commented like a true Berliner. We could save air on them, or we could give them a little more than we should. Everyone started laughing. Not a single muscle in the Uzbeks trembled. I would have given a lot to know what they were thinking when they heard us laughing. But what were we to do? All we had to do was to make a report of the incident and both of them would be shot. The non-commissioned officer in charge of the warehouse, whose precious petrol, 100 jerry cans of smuggled goods, had now turned to smoke, suggested that they should simply be flogged. However, no one had the right to flog the wounded. This was 100 jerry cans of petrol worth 2 human lives. In this case, it was impossible to find a compromise solution. Either we make an official report and then these 2 will be shot, or we will not take any steps at all. What about the rather valuable wireframe? Do we take it off the dead man's arm after the execution and continue to use it? And what do we do if it is damaged? Sergeant Fush saved the Uzbeks' lives. The company commander was away, so the entire responsibility for making the decision fell on my shoulders. Herman had already figured out what to do with our Uzbek saboteurs. Do, he shouted at them both. Bo, the Russian equivalent of the word get out. The Uzbeks jumped up. He walked them to the gate. They probably thought we were going to hunt them down. He shouted at them again. The two of them rushed off running, and we kept laughing. The sun was shining brightly. The sea, which the ancient Greeks called the Pontus of Euxine, was making a noise in the distance. My soul was overflowing with a feeling of happiness. Half an hour later, I drove to Theodosia. Halfway along the road, I saw Uzbeks wandering along the road. We slowed down. They stopped. But we passed them, and a smile lit up both Asian faces. I might well have been court-martialed for such an act 2 years later. After we managed to retake the Kerch Peninsula, we were again transferred to Sevastopol. Crimea became as familiar to us as the parade ground of our home unit. In the steppe near Sheikh Eli, there was a tree that could serve as a reference point within a radius of up to 20 kilometers. In the steppe villages, there were no spires on the churches. Sometimes we had to see a mirage, the shaky contours of the city, over the Savash, a line of telegraph wires suspended on steel poles, each with 5 insulators, stretched across the whole of northern Crimea from Kerch to Perikop. It was an Anglo-Indian telegraph line. It stretched from Calcutta through Persia, the Caucasus, across the Black Sea to the Crimea, and then across the expanse of Russia to Denmark, and from there along the bottom of the North Sea to London. From time to time, someone had the idea of walking along this copper line connecting the continents. London to Calcutta. Will there ever be a peace here that someone will not break again? It's like a tortoise in its shell. The conqueror in a foreign country shuts himself off from everything foreign by his habitual conceptions. It is difficult to understand a foreign country if you have come to it only to conquer it. For several decades, these copper wires served the people. They carried all sorts of messages: stock market prices, welcome telegrams, condolence telegrams, important news, from the death of Edward VI to the declaration of war in 1939 and the like. Now they sagged helplessly, and anyone who needed copper could cut them off. I positioned the company on the bank of a clear mountain stream that ran through an inexpressibly beautiful plain on the edge of a mountain range. In the evening I felt chills and fever. At first I thought it was an attack of malaria, but it turned out to be rubella, which I had contracted from one of the local children. I had to go to the hospital. What followed was a lapse of memory for several weeks, which I spent in a feverish delirium. On the very day we captured Sevastopol, I was finally able to be discharged from the hospital. Rombach sent a car to meet me. The car took me to North Bay, just to the right of Sevastopol, right next to the houses I had viewed through the stereotelescopic tube at Colonel Rombach's command post during the winter. The city had been badly damaged by artillery fire, but its beauty peeped through even the ruins. After it was destroyed during the Crimean War in the 1960s, the Russian Tsar endeavored to rebuild it again in the late classical style. The facades of many of the buildings still stood intact. The harbour was clogged with half-submerged ships. One of the walls of the power station crumbled away, and the enormous turbines could be seen inside the building. Fires were still blazing in many places. Russian prisoners cleared the streets of debris, so after a while traffic resumed. The bronze monument to General Totobin, who led the defence of Sevastopol during the Crimean War, was still standing, but his head had been smashed off and was lying next to the pedestal. Later, when we decided to repair the monument, the head suddenly disappeared. One of the regimental commanders of our division discovered it quite by accident in the Berlin Military Museum when he went home on leave. After much trouble, the heavy bronze head was brought back to Sevastopol and put in its rightful place. The artillery fort on Malakoff Mound was still a reminder of the gallant Frenchman, Colonel MacMahon. When he received the order to retreat after having succeeded in breaking into the fortress at the cost of heavy losses, he gave the following now famous reply: "I am tired, he." The siege of Sevastopol during the First Crimean War has already become history. The story of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. A marvellous woman with a good heart who devoted herself to caring for the wounded, although she had to suffer many hardships, losses, and sometimes just misunderstandings. She came to Crimea from England, and for the first time in modern military history organised proper care for the wounded. The memory of her lives on through the ages. Silent pain tries to kiss. Her shadow but falls. From the darkening walls. Longfellow, Rombach, who was appointed chief of the medical service of the Sevastopol garrison, faced the danger of spreading epidemics. It was by no means possible to exclude such a possibility. The city's water supply system was completely destroyed. Unburied corpses lay everywhere. Innumerable hordes of flies were flying about. In the rooms we occupied, the walls were so densely covered with these insects that they seemed to be painted black. The flies landed in layers, one on top of the other. When we dined, we had to drive them away from the food all the way from plate to mouth, and still we swallowed them by the dozens. We did not know if the Russians suffered from infectious diseases. Numerous cases of dysentery were noted among the German soldiers. Malaria is characteristic of the Crimea, thanks to shipping it moves between Sevastopol, the ports of the Caucasus, Asia Minor, and Constantinople. Individual outbreaks of bubonic plague are occasionally recorded here even in peacetime. During the siege, the city was infested with an incredible number of rats. But nevertheless, the only epidemic that broke out in the city after its capture was a viral infection carried by flies. Many problems had to be solved at the same time. We were surprised to find no wounded civilians in the city, but Sergeant Kinzel soon found them in the cathedral cellars. I went there, taking some orderlies with me. Old women, young women, children, and old men lay side by side on bedding of straw. Their wounds were well operated on, but instead of bandages they were bandaged with mere scraps of clothing. Probably the Russians had run out of real bandages. In one corner, a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church was praying on his knees. He raised his hand with a cross. The flickering light from the candle barely reached the ceiling of the cellar, but it was reflected in the precious stones with which the cross was studded. He murmured a prayer. Before him lay a dying old woman, one of her bony, arthritic hands groping convulsively for air. Her fellow sufferers repeated the words of the prayer after the priest. A deep, gurgling sound escaped from the elderly woman's throat, and then she died. The priest rose from his knees. The old woman's arm remained slightly raised. The orders began to make bandages. Kinzel went in search of a suitable building into which we could move the wounded. Some were sent to the field kitchen where they received hot tea and food. Even being in an inert, lethargic state, these poor people began to realize that something good was being tried for them. The priest shook my hand firmly in gratitude. But to get to the heart of the matter, we were not to blame for these people's plight, were we? When I returned to the premises we occupied, which were on the very outskirts of the city, above the Chersonese Peninsula, Rombach was already waiting for me there. I wanted to tell him what I had seen, but he would not let me say a word. He only sighed. Come with me. We drove about 1 kilometre south of the town. Among the vineyards that spread out on the southern slopes of Sevastopol, not so far from the place where Iphigenia gazed into the distance of the Pontus Euxine towards Hellas, the Russians had abandoned their wounded. Thousands of them lay among the vineyards. For days they had eaten nothing, and for 48 hours they had drunk nothing. Most of them had not been given any surgical treatment. Hour after hour they roasted in the sun. Moans echoed continuously over the hills. The despair of these war-stricken people did not reach the heavens. It seemed to flow like a light breeze over the hills. In the valley itself we saw 7 sites surrounded by barbed wire, in which upwards of 30,000 healthy prisoners were gathered and awaiting their fate. Here and there sporadic shots rang. Rombach and I looked at each other. What to do? We could carry out 10, 20, 50, even 100 operations. But 2,000 or 3,000? That would take many, many days. In that time, hundreds of wounded will die. Besides, all those people are dying of thirst. A whole host of problems, beyond our real capabilities, had to be solved immediately. There wasn't a single person in our medical company who didn't dream of resting for at least an hour in the next 2 days. Rombach went to Simferopol to collect everything necessary, including tents, surgical instruments, bandages and medicines that the army would be able to provide. I went to the commandant of the POW camp to ask him to release any Russian doctors, surgeons and orderlies who might be among the prisoners to help us. The commandant turned out to be an amiable Viennese. He lived in a tent near the camps where the prisoners were held. I introduced myself and explained to him that I had orders to help the wounded Russians, and that I would be grateful for any help he could give. Smiling, he asked, "Will a machine gun do?" I was forced to remain polite. If the commandant did not want it, no one could force him to hand over the captured doctors to me. I explained to him that we are a bit old-fashioned people and we want to help the wounded. I had to ask him to allow me to select doctors among the Russians. He behaved quite honourably and said that he wished to grant my request. An appeal was circulated through the interpreters saying that all doctors and surgeons should come forward. There was no movement. The Russians were transfixed with disbelief. Eventually, we found a surgeon whose father was a professor at St. Petersburg University. I was able to explain to him what all this was for, and he rounded up all the doctors in the camp. There turned out to be about 30 of them. Then there were about 50 paramedics and not very qualified doctors. These were people who had received a basic medical education and were something between doctors and orderlies. Among the doctors were 6 women, 2 of whom were qualified surgeons. The Russians were in a state of depression. Surrender after nearly 9 months of fierce and heroic resistance can throw anyone off balance. Defeat is always demoralizing. The Russians looked at me with a sense of complete apathy. Everything I said to them seemed to be spoken to the wind of sighs and despair. They used the same methods of treatment as we did. The great Frenchman Charcot, who laid the foundations of the treatment of mental illness, received an honorary doctorate from the University of Kiev. The great Russian scientist Pavlov, one of the founders of modern physiology, was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. One of the 2 women surgeons, who was also extremely beautiful, concluded by saying 1 or 2 sentences to the assembled Russians, which my interpreter could not understand. The Russians responded by saying that they were willing to cooperate with me. To begin with, they were provided with food and cigarettes. A few hours later, Rombach returned at the head of a small convoy of lorries. The engineers helped us unload the first few tents, huge tents that could hold at least 100 wounded men each. We left their bottoms open so that a light, pleasant breeze would blow in. We always put 2 tents side by side and connected their entrances with a plywood floor. The operating tables were placed under it so we could work in the fresh air, and besides, we were in the shade. Toward evening, the Russians started doing operations on 12 tables. More than 100 amputations were performed on the first day. The most pressing problem was water. The centralized water supply in Sevastopol was destroyed, and water had to be taken from several wells. There were rumors that the Russians had poisoned all the available wells. From a medical point of view, I could not even imagine how this could have been done at all, and the whole story turned out to be a complete fiction. But many of them were clogged with all sorts of rubbish, and others were filled with dead people and animals. One sergeant found a well with drinkable water just half a kilometre from the vineyards, but the water was almost 30 metres deep. This meant it could not be reached by hand. The soldiers fixed a stationary engine they had found somewhere and ran a pipeline directly to the tents. It consisted of gas pipes taken from damaged city utilities, connected to rubber tubing from Russian gas masks. At least it was something of a start. A thin trickle of warm and dirty water was clearly not enough to save hundreds of people from the deaths that would follow from thirst. The wounded were beginning to believe in their salvation, but we could not provide them with good water as quickly as was necessary. About every hour I went round the wounded to select among them those who needed urgent surgery. As I passed through the tents, they would turn to me and, holding out their hands, say, "Water, sir, water." Sometimes at night I still dream of that cry, "Water, sir, water." Then they began to die. Again and again we tried to find a way out of the situation. In the meantime, down in North Bay, about 2.5 kilometres away, several large wells had been cleared, and we decided to send all the walking sick there. This was to reduce by about 1,200 the number of wounded we had to supply with water. Only a small proportion of the total number of wounded continued to live in tents. The majority preferred to lie in the fresh air. We selected a group of lightly wounded Russians to assist us as warders, and in order that they might be distinguished from the general mass, they wore a gauze bandage on their left arm. We sent these men through the vineyards with the task of informing all who could move on their own to gather in groups and go down to the wells. The prisoners, all as one in a state of apathy, did not even move. So the warders took vines in their hands and began to whip the wounded with them. This made many of them rise. We stood by and watched. There was no point in interfering with this cruel procedure, for it saved many people from death. With a slow gait, leaning on sticks and supporting each other, surrounded by clouds of flies, they waddled towards the wells. In a long, heart-wrenching procession, they travelled through the land of Iphigenia under the scorching Crimean sun. They quenched their thirst and grew a little stronger. This would help them on their way to the barbarian kingdom. We were only the front line of that kingdom. Fortitude of spirit without justice is the lot of sinners. Best Ambrosius said so 15 centuries ago. Over the next few days, we were able to get the situation under control. After we had sent everyone who could move on their own to Severnaya Bay, we were left with about 1,200 seriously wounded in our care. The Russian doctors worked day and night, and they worked very well. The 2 female surgeons, who were surprisingly tireless, were especially good at their duties. A sort of alliance quickly developed between them and the German non-commissioned officers we attached to them. During the military campaigns in Poland, France, Greece, and Russia, these non-commissioned officers had acquired enormous practical experience in surgery. They were well versed in the symptoms. They knew perfectly well what operative procedures were required in particular cases. On the second day, Votruba, who had just recently been promoted to the rank of sergeant, approached me. He informed me that the female surgeon, whose name was Anastasia Filipovna, was not following my instructions. On several occasions when I had recommended amputations, she had not carried them out. Was this just willfulness? Some form of sabotage? We were often convinced that the thinking of Russians is very different from ours, so nothing could surprise us. But it just so happened that this was the very woman who had persuaded her colleagues to cooperate with us. I approached her and asked her to explain what was going on. She was actually quite frightened. This example made it clear to me what pernicious consequences any unrestricted power of one person over another can have. 20th century prisoners of war had fewer rights than Roman slaves 2,000 years ago. The Roman slave was protected by the law. It was a harsh law, but it was a law nonetheless. Here, on the other hand, arbitrariness reigned supreme. Any dissatisfaction on my part meant for a Russian to return to a prisoner of war camp. Unfortunately, the type of people who seek complete domination over other people is not rare, even among civilized nations. In the anarchy of war, the type of people who seek power to compensate for their inferiority complex is rapidly growing in number. In the course of our conversation, a very simple fact came to light. Russian military surgeons act much more decisively than ours, and our surgeons do not have as much experience in treating bullet wounds under such extreme conditions as the Russian prisoners found themselves in. Her explanation was that during the last winter the Russians had proved able to treat their wounded much more effectively than our doctors had treated theirs. In our medical tradition, it was not customary to assert oneself by means of orders alone. It was important to explain to our Russian colleagues that in this case, from the medical point of view, the radical solution I proposed was justified. I went round the tents and selected 10 patients with gunshot wounds to the knee who had not been amputated. The patients were selected according to the dates on which they received their wounds. The first of them had been wounded only 2 days earlier. His condition was relatively good. The last of them had been wounded 10 days ago. He was dying. I placed all these men in a row in the shade of one of the tents. Their bandages had been removed. The sight was something like slow motion in a film. Then I gathered the Russian doctors and placed them along the chain of wounded. This sight convinced them that it was us who were right and that they should act much more decisively than before. If the last of the wounded had been amputated immediately after he was hit, his life might have been saved. The first still had a chance of salvation. When at the conclusion of the examination we got to the last person in the row, which was the very wounded man who was dying, Anastasia Filipovna sobbed. This is a sign that we are living in an unhealthy world, because even 10 years after the events described, I cannot without risk to them name the true names of those Russian doctors who so selflessly fulfilled their obligations under such difficult conditions. Even now, on charges of cooperation with the enemy, they can be punished for having served under the invisible flag. We confiscated for our purposes the building of the former NKVD prison in Sevastopol, and during the next week transferred all the Russian wounded to this stone building. At least it was cooler here. A hospital for Russian civilians was also opened, equipped with X-ray machines, and in addition there were real beds. Then there was the problem of determining the status of our Russian auxiliaries. We were part of a combat division. It was clear that it would not stay in the Crimea for long. When we left here, we would not be able to exert any influence on the further work of the medical service in Sevastopol, which had been created with such labour. The party was already preparing to take control of this territory, and all our work could be nullified with a stroke of a pen. It was not enough that we were able to get the Russian doctors and surgeons out of the prisoner of war camp. We had to make them cease to be considered prisoners of war and become mere civilians. This could only be done by substituting documents, and only with the knowledge and consent of the commandant of the POW camp. We were helped by a happy accident. The commandant did discover that he had 700 prisoners missing from his camp. He could not even guess where they had disappeared to, whether some mistake had been made in the lists or whether they had actually disappeared. Most likely, most of them simply escaped and went to the mountains to the partisans. The Russians began supplying these units from the air with arms, ammunition, and food. The commandant of the camp could expect serious trouble from the inspectors if any shortage of prisoners was discovered, so we suggested to him that he should send us every day, on paper only, 100 prisoners allegedly suffering from dysentery. We, in our turn, could write off 20 to 25 men out of this 100 every day as irrecoverable losses. The agreement was reached on condition that the commandant would not claim the doctors and surgeons whom he placed at our disposal. We tried not to think much about the cynicism of the whole thing. It was a strategy of our own war. Everything was going according to plan. We did not take into account only one thing, that our ruse may draw the attention of someone from higher authority. According to the papers, the outbreak of dysentery in the city had reached alarming proportions, so the alarm was raised. We were informed that a high-ranking medical officer would be visiting us tomorrow. The situation was becoming threatening. However, our old gang came to the rescue. All the sick and wounded who had any intestinal diseases were gathered together in one tent. Within a few hours, the soldiers had erected a latrine, which was immediately filled accordingly. Up to a centon of lime mortar was poured into the yard. It was surrounded with barbed wire, and warning signs were hung everywhere. I then went to see Major Fabricius, a young officer attached to the general staff, who was acting chief of staff of our division. Fabricius was a man of a broad soul and sharp mind, distinguished himself in the development of tactical operations, was an implacable enemy of the Nazi party, and finally just a decent man. I told him the whole story. He laughed and said that he would be happy to play the role of the local chief of our Potemkin village. Count Potemkin, a Russian politician of the 18th century, was constructing sham villages that were meant to impress the Tsarina as she travelled through the south of Russia. The presence of the Major of the General Staff should naturally make a favourable impression during the forthcoming inspection. Fabricius, in turn, told the story to the General, and the latter expressed his desire to invite the high medical officials to his house for dinner. And in fact, this decision turned out to be our salvation. At first there were no problems. Our magnificent washroom looked quite convincing, but the high-ranking visitor, an experienced infectious disease specialist, began to delve deeper and deeper into the details. Gradually, the situation began to complicate. Major Fabricius cast a thoughtful glance at his watch. "Gentlemen, the General is expecting you. We are already 10 minutes late, and after lunch you're in for an exciting ride around the harbour." No one had the right to test the General's patience. We were saved. Within a few days we were able to manage the epidemic of dysentery, and a few weeks later Rombach, who was Chief of Medical Services of the garrison, was even awarded for this outstanding achievement. Our Russian doctors and surgeons became simply civilians, and right up until the Russians took the city in 1944, they continued to provide medical care to the people of Sevastopol. Gradually, a period of time that could be characterized as relatively peaceful became a thing of the past. Nazi ideas continued to penetrate our consciousness little by little, and then the massacres began. All Jewish residents of Sevastopol were rounded up in one wing of the former NKVD prison and then sentenced to death. The condemned were driven into the back of a large covered lorry. The door closed behind them. The engine ran at full power. Exhaust fumes began to flow inside the vehicle. After a few minutes, the horrific screams gradually subsided and the driver could switch off the ignition. The corpses were buried in an anti-tank ditch outside the town. We all knew it, but there was nothing we could do. If anyone tried to protest or take any action against these executioners, they were arrested for 24 hours and then disappeared without a trace. This was one of the characteristic features of the totalitarian system established in our country, which did not give its opponents the opportunity to die as martyrs for their beliefs. There was no shortage of those willing to do so, but the totalitarian state exterminated its opponents quietly and anonymously. A person who preferred death instead of bearing all these atrocities in silence sacrificed his life in vain. Of course, I do not mean to say that such self-sacrifice was completely meaningless from a moral point of view. I only want to say that, from the practical point of view, it was completely useless. It was an unbearably hot summer in the Crimea. In Yalta, situated on the Russian Riviera, holiday homes were opened for the troops. It just so happened that Corporal Sambo and Sergeant Herman, the old RTU, were playing scat on the same terrace on which Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin would be pictured sitting 2 years later. In the mountainous area known as Yala, the road through the mountains that led from Simferopol to Yalta was periodically cut by an army of partisans. The Russians continued their resistance even in the catacombs near. One day Russian aeroplanes on a glancing flight attacked the terrace of a castle on the coast, on which the commander of the German forces in the Crimea was giving a gala dinner for his subordinates, whom he had just awarded Knight's Crosses. The next day the whole Crimea was gasping with laughter as they listened to stories of the speed with which these heroes dived under tables and hid in cellars. We did not attach much importance to the omens with which the gods were endeavouring to keep us from the sin of pride. The German armies were rushing forward across the Don and Kuban to the Caucasus. They reached the coast of the Caspian Sea. They reached the Volga. Then we first heard the name Stalingrad. We were all filled with confidence in victory. The warlike Germanic tribes, the modern Ostrogoths, began to dream of settling the Crimea. As these lands were no man's land, we tried to claim them for ourselves, just as the gold miners in the Klondike once did. We decided among ourselves where a sheep pen would be built, where peach orchards would blossom, and where corn would grow. At the time of the great migration of peoples, the Ostrogoth Empire was founded here in southern Russia. They disappeared without a trace in the stream of time, and traces of them have been lost. It is universally believed, though not proven, that these legendary people did not disappear in the darkness of the past and turned into our honoured ancestors. The dream of world domination captured the minds of even the most sober-minded among us. Then the victorious descendants of the Ostrogoths will go home on holiday and find themselves back in the working-class suburbs of Berlin or in the small towns of Pomerania and Brandenburg that are so familiar to them. When they return home, worried that in the new Reich, the things that seem familiar to them are becoming more and more alien and unfamiliar, they will realize that Germany is no longer their home, that it is the army that has become their home and the war their way of life. When the autumn storms came, and the tumbleweeds again swept across the vast steppes in unthinkable zigzags, the god of war dropped his last mask. The dam holding back the flow of calamities burst. Trouble swept over the thickets, dreams, corpses of the dead, over the tears of those who suffered and the courage of those who endured suffering, over the horror of despair and desperate bravery. Another page of history was turned. The road on which we were moving towards Krasnodar, formerly Ekaterinoda, ran along the Sea of Azov. In the early autumn of 1942, the rains came again, and our struggle with the thaw began anew. A penetrating north or northeast wind blew from the seaside, throwing a mixture of snow and rain in our faces. Since we had been travelling all day, our left cheeks were gradually freezing harder than our right cheeks. The wheels of our wagons got deeper and deeper stuck in the mud on the roads, and we were constantly trying to hurry around the road potholes in the fields. From time to time we were again forced to unharness the horses from one wagon and harness them to another. From time to time again it was only at great cost to pull the wagons out of the mud. From time to time again it seemed to us that we were stuck once and for all. On some days we could not cover more than 2 or 3 kilometers in a day. We had to forage for fodder for the horses. Shortly before the events described, even before the rains came, we could cover in one day the distance that we now had to spend a whole week travelling. I was expecting the approach of our medical company at the point where the road makes a sharp turn to the south, that is, away from the seashore. In this desolate area I found an abandoned peasant's house where the personnel could be accommodated. Next to it was a large stable. We covered with blankets the holes in the walls where there had once probably been windows. It was my duty to pull our company's wagons out of the moving columns of troops as they passed through the place, and if they slipped past, there was no way of getting them back. The horses had to spend the night in the open field. At this time we had one not quite ordinary problem. Having exceeded the quota by a lot, we had sent more than half of our personnel on leave. If fighting started, it could have very unpleasant consequences for us. Besides, when we received the order to redeploy in Simferopol, there were not even enough men available to put them as carriage drivers on all the wagons with the equipment we had. Those were delightful days. Sergeant Herman appeared and politely asked if we could be invited to lunch in the non-commissioned officers' mess hall. Rombach accepted the invitation. What's cooking in there? A piano. Herman's sly face took on a serious expression. I mean, what's cooking for lunch there? A piano. Piano? We have just changed it for 3 sheep. Our non-commissioned officers were gradually adopting the habits of the Russian boyars. Shashliks were prepared from mutton. During lunch, the reliable and dependable Sergeant Klein, who was in charge of the dressing room, told us how he had visited his former master, the owner of a transport agency, during his holiday. He said that he would take me back to work after the end of the war, but would only pay me half of my former salary. I asked him why only half. Because, said the old bastard, you're not as smart as I used to think you were. Why? You can't be smart if you spent the whole war at the front. You could have found a better use for yourself. We laughed. Everyone realized how right the old man was. But after 3 years of war, a kind of spiritual closeness arose between us. Every person who left us took with him a part of ourselves. There remained loyalty, devotion, memory of joint trials, humour and mutual understanding. There was something comforting in knowing that you could rely on another in any circumstance. The phenomenon of combat brotherhood had its charm, during all the terrible disasters that war brings with it. Even if, by the will of circumstances, there are completely different people, no matter how different their characters, they have no choice but to be friends. However, of course, it is not a question of justifying war, just on the grounds that some things derived from it do not look so repulsive. During this lunch, we talked at length about all the absentees who were on leave. Several corporals agreed to put on their private uniforms and take the riders' places. Petruba, who was recognized by the local population as an interpreter, invited 10 civilians. All the Russians knew perfectly well how to handle horses, so 10 men for such work could be found without much difficulty. They received money and vodka for themselves, personally, and bread for their families. Dressed in German military uniforms, they were ready to accompany us for over 200 kilometers, although we could not guarantee them that they would be able to get back to Simferopol. They distinguished us from the party more accurately than we ourselves could do. All this flashed through my mind as I waited for my company. From the shore came the sound of the surf. The storm was raging over the sea as well as over the land. Torn clouds flew over the land, seagulls were shrieking with shrill cries. Since the beginning of time, nature has been preserved in its pristine beauty in some forgotten corners of the earth. Hour after hour, I looked at the white strip of foam left by the escaping waves. The Sea of Azov is usually calm, but a storm drove the waves onto its pristine shores. I could feel the cold slowly starting to creep into my body. I could warm up with a little walk, of course, but I had nothing to shelter me from the raindrops that were quickly turning to ice. I headed towards a small house that was about 200 meters away. Behind its walls, I could at least take shelter from the storm for a few minutes and even smoke a cigarette. There were people living in the house, and I went inside. My glasses were fogged up. I tried to wipe them with my numb fingers and dropped them. There was only one room in the lodge, where 3 soldiers were sitting on a bench against the wall. They waved their hands in what could be taken as a salute if they wished. In principle, I should have given them a severe reprimand. In the German army, saluting is a symbol of discipline, and the very existence of the army depends on discipline. But here, in this abandoned cottage, cold, storm-torn, which could have been Adam's first home after his expulsion from the Garden of Eden, a salute would have looked equally ridiculous as a reprimand. A woman was frying a dozen eggs on a huge frying pan, standing on iron circles that covered a rounded opening in the top of the oven. A second woman, very old, wrapped in a sheepskin, was lying on a dais above the large dobed oven. A flock of small children, the youngest of whom were quite naked, were crawling about under our feet. They were playing with a bristle-covered black pig, which ran fearfully about this wretched hut. But when my nose regained the ability to smell, I instantly realized that there was such an incredible stench that I preferred to go outside again and freeze in the fresh air for another half-hour before I ventured inside the house again. By His grace, God has given us the ability to live only in a narrow spectrum of electromagnetic waves between the absolute freezing point of 273 degrees Celsius, the temperature of open space in the universe, and a few million degrees at the center of the sun. There is a gap of less than 100 degrees in which living things can live. Similarly, there is a very narrow gap in the spectrum of possibilities in which culture and civilization can exist. Man has been expelled from paradise, and he will never return there again. What if this so-called progress is just one turn of a spiral back to a primitive state? Finally, towards evening, our company arrived. Nothing warmed me more than the gratitude from the people for whom I had found a haven in the situation. In the large stable we lay down on the straw among the horses and fell asleep as only soldiers can sleep. The next morning we found a country road, following which we were able to cut a path of 8 kilometres. After 3 days the frost struck. The company set out in the middle of the night and continued to move forward until the ground under the rays of the sun did not thaw again. During this time the company moved forward about 12 kilometres. Soon the motorway turned into a sort of dirt road. Sambo managed to get to Krasnodar on his motorbike, and he came back with the very welcome news that our old friends from the bridge-building column commanded by Captain Stubb were there. Stubb immediately sent 3 of his marvellous tractors to us, one of which was loaded with hay. We rested for a whole day, so the horses could get plenty to eat, then hitched our wagons to the tractors and moved off. The charioteers saddled their heavy horses with harness on and rode alongside. Thus, when we entered Krasnodar, from the outside our company most resembled a gypsy tabor. A company camped in private houses. Captain Stubb had made careful preparations for our arrival. He took care of us like a kind-hearted father and endeavoured to ensure that we did not lack anything. For the first time in our lives, we were able to eat caviar straight from tin cans. The Kuban is one of the rivers where the sturgeon is found. In Krasnodar, there were still many signs left over from the Tsarist times. The totalitarian regime could not put its imprint on the unique originality of these places. Cossacks still wore their traditional clothes, fur hats made of Persian karakul and red shirts with embroidery on the chest. Everything bore the stamp of strangeness, and the influence of the East was clearly felt in the way they rode down the street, high in the saddle, sitting straight as a poker on their fast and extremely hardy little horses. There were even antiquities shops here, where bright, dark-eyed Armenians offered for sale antique silverware and carpets. One could buy a splendid Persian carpet for a can of coffee. Business was quickly established between the soldiers and the traders, but as the soldiers had to carry all their possessions on their backs, the trade excitement quickly waned. As soon as we settled down to have a heart-to-heart talk with Captain Stubb, we were informed that our quartermaster had returned from leave. He was a master of administrative matters, but more than anything else, this cheerful young man with the big blue eyes loved to live beautifully. He combined this passion with an exorbitant desire for popularity. It was difficult to reconcile the two, but he solved the problem brilliantly, endeavouring to make the whole company live as well as he did, so that we found nothing objectionable in his desires. The quartermaster appeared accompanied by 35 men of our company, when he was informed at Kherson that he would no longer return to the Crimea, and was instead ordered to proceed to the Terek. He behaved prudently and far-sightedly. It was obviously difficult not to notice that half of our medical company had still not returned from leave, so he had to spend several days and nights at the railway station in Krasnodar getting our men off the trains. After his return, he settled in the house of the prettiest girl in town. In spite of this circumstance, a longing settled in his big blue eyes, and once he said that she was a communist to the core, and therefore he had to behave with her with extreme caution. One day I went round to his house, so I had a chance to have a look at this girl. She lived in a large house, and the entrance to the living quarters was through a gallery that stretched round a courtyard in which all the inhabitants of the house gathered. Someone would tell a story and the others would laugh. Here, too, stood a scrawny goat and a lousy dog. It was probably one of the funny stories written by Mikhail Zoshenko. I climbed the rickety, creaky stairs, and the assembled people looked at me with curiosity. The door was opened by an old woman dressed in a modest dress, patched and repatched 100 times, the same kind of dress worn by almost all women in Russia. The quartermaster put a bottle of good old Armagnac on the table in front of me. Then an old woman brought tea in an antique and very valuable silver teapot, which was a fine example of Russian classical style. She poured the tea. I looked at her, and while I was looking at her, I remembered the beautiful hands of an old lady, the mistress of a castle in Lower Bavaria, where I had often been a guest. This old lady had hands exactly like hers, though they were calloused by work. But the gracefulness of her movements when she poured tea would be befitting the mistress of any castle. When I first looked at her, I noticed at once the traces of former beauty in her face. Of course, she's an ex. I thanked her in French. Thank you very much, madame. With a shriek of surprise, she dropped the teapot. Similarly, in French, she replied, "Oh, sir, do you speak French? Have you been to Paris? Have you—" And then something extraordinary happened. With that haste which makes Russian women speak French even faster than French women, she tried to express her surprise. This effort, however, proved too much for her. She began to stammer and gasp. She could not find the right words. She had already forgotten French and began to cry. Her daughter came into the room. She probably heard her mother crying. Tamara wore what was called a Cossack, a knee-length dress that emphasized her figure, and leather riding boots. Her black hair was cut short. She had dark, expressive eyes, a broad face with delicately shaped temples, a slightly swarthy colour with a rosy blush on her cheeks, and snow-white teeth. She had a natural beauty, grande beauté, as the French say, which is extremely rare. I was speechless with admiration. Perhaps she was used to making such an impression on men. The prudent quartermaster looked embarrassed. The four of us finally had tea. The old lady was an aristocrat by birth. In her youth, she had been wealthy, owning a landed property of some 80,000 square acres near Yekaterinburg in the Urals. She travelled extensively and knew Europe well. Her husband died during the Civil War as he served as an officer in Denikin's army. Tamara Mikhailovna grew up already after the revolution. She joined the Komsomol, a youth communist organization, and later became a member of the Communist Party. She knew nothing of the splendor in which her mother used to live. Not only did she remember nothing about it, but she was even convinced that her mother's stories were counter-revolutionary propaganda. Although she did not speak French, her German was quite passable. Until the outbreak of World War II, German was among the compulsory subjects studied in Soviet secondary schools. The old woman asked me, tell her about Paris. The first thing I told her was about the Paris metro. I knew that Soviet propaganda praised the Moscow metro as the greatest achievement of the socialist state. Tamara Mikhailovna refused to believe that an underground railway in Paris had already existed for a generation. The elderly woman, satisfied that all her words were confirmed, urged me to continue with my stories. And so we sat there. I spoke of the Eiffel Tower, of the small artistic cafes in Montmartre, of the 7 hills on which Rome stands, and of Steeptiers Square in that city, next to which is the Vatican, of Trafalgar Square and the British Museum in London, of Berlin and the Sans Souci Palace, of Madrid and the Escorial Palace. Around this beautiful girl, one world was crumbling and another was emerging. She began to pelt me with questions. Gradually, the other inhabitants of the house began to gather, intrigued by what was happening. Tea was poured non-stop and then began in 3 languages. One of those splendid evenings which Russians are consummate masters of, one of those evenings spent in stormy discussions filled with genuine surprise, sincere enthusiasm, and good humour. It was only after conquering half the country that the young quartermaster began at last to understand something of it. When late in the evening the girl and I went out for a breath of fresh air on the balcony, a huge Caucasian moon hung in the sky above us. We talked about Russia, about Mother Russia, about her old Russia, about its great past, about its purpose in this world, about the simple people. This Russia has not yet completely disappeared. The 30 years that have passed since the revolution have not changed anything in the soul of a Russian woman. If anyone will survive the horrors of the revolution. But the moon had made its adjustments to the plans of the Russian woman and the German who stood looking at her. I was not a guest in this country, and I had tasks to fulfill. I had to warn this beautiful young woman that since she was a member of the Communist Party, her life was in danger. It was only through a happy accident that she was soon able to escape arrest. The late autumn of 1942 was the turning point in the great drama played out on the steppes. We were no longer on the Russian frontier. We had long ago approached the vital centers of the enemy. We had set a huge, mighty nation in motion. From Krasnodar, we were sent by rail 400 kilometers in a southeasterly direction. We landed at Mozdok, which is situated quite near Vladikavkaz. This city, which covered the mountain passage to Tiflis from the north and which the Russians desperately defended, was the jewel of the Caucasus. We were nearer the borders of India than the borders of our homeland. In those days, Asia, vast mysterious Asia, appeared on our horizon. The sun was rising over the Caspian Sea and over ancient Tiflis, the capital of the Georgian kings where Arabs, Turks, Persians had once passed. It was there that Stalin took the first steps in his political career. Once, in 1918, it had already been occupied by German troops, Tiflis being our desired goal. We made an enormous journey along the northern shores of the Black Sea, from Komotini in Greece to Mozdok in the North Caucasus. From a point some 300 kilometers west of Constantinople to a point 200 kilometers north of Tiflis, on the shores of the Aegean Sea, near Alexandropolis. We followed Odysseus to the cave of Polyphemus. Near Batum in ancient Colchis, we entered the land from which Jason had brought the Golden Fleece. We became a horde of wandering warriors. But we never managed to bring home the Golden Fleece or the treasure. We were destined to go through hardships before we returned to the land of our ancestors. Our only reward for all this was our memories. Travelling by rail is usually furnished with certain comforts for ordinary soldiers. Being experienced in overcoming any difficulties they might encounter en route, our men installed stoves in the goods wagons in which the horses were transported. Naturally, this was strictly forbidden, as straw could easily ignite. If the doors were closed, the 6 horses that were transported in each wagon were warm enough without any stove. But everyone wanted the doors open. They wanted to see the world. A patrolman at the railway station in Krasnodar, who began to object to the stove, was easily persuaded with the help of a bottle of vodka that there was no danger. In the passenger carriage in which the personnel travelled, Sergeant Herman installed a crank pipe for heating, which he had been carrying along with the operating equipment since he had acquired it in Romania. We persuaded the engineer to hitch our passenger wagon behind the steam locomotive and then connected the wagon to it with this crank steam pipe. All the wagons travelled on European-style track. For several days we travelled through places that had only recently been mentioned in Wehrmacht reports. We liked to sit for hours in the goods wagons. From them we had the best view of the constantly changing Caucasian landscape, noble and spacious, covered with huge fields of corn and thickets of walnuts. We had a lot of free time. We had an opportunity to sleep and talk in peace and quiet. During their holidays, most of our men had a severe shock. The discontent that had swept over the whole of Germany had made a very heavy impression on them. Some of our men accompanied trains travelling to Germany as orderlies. These trains were carrying Russian men and women who had been recruited in Sevastopol on a completely voluntary basis to work in the war industry. Our orderlies were extremely alarmed at the conditions under which these people were travelling. We still maintained good relations with the Russians. Our people were unaware that these Russians were going straight into slavery, and all the shortcomings which they themselves witnessed were simply written off as defects in organization. However, there was no further need for this. The Nazi Party solemnly proclaimed the liberation of the Russian people from Bolshevik slavery and allowed for the sake of appearances to establish a puppet Ukrainian government in Kiev, which was only allowed to write its own constitution. Hundreds of thousands of Russians fought in the ranks of the German army and showed the same marvelous bravery as during their recent service in the Red Army. They fought for the liberation of their country from Soviet rule. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of prisoners who expressed no particular desire to fight against communism were starving to death in concentration camps scattered throughout the Ukraine. Our men received similar information from the convoys they encountered from time to time on the trains. Captain Count Wurm, an old cavalry officer who came from the South German nobility, later told me about the experiences he had as commander of a detachment of Cossacks. During the summer campaign of 1942, he commanded 3 squadrons in the steppes near Alista. Each squadron had only 2 German officers and a few German sergeants. The Cossacks were above all praise. One day they came to him and told him that their home stanzas were nearby and that they wanted to go home and bring fresh horses from there, as well as new volunteers. The situation was somewhat ambivalent. The Cossacks could simply desert and join the Red Army, but Count Wurm gave his consent without any hesitation. He knew that you cannot expect loyal service from the men if you do not trust them. For 2 days, the small group of Germans was left completely alone in the vast steppe. On the 3rd morning, the Cossacks returned back. None of them escaped. Moreover, they brought 30 new volunteers with them. The Cossack ataman proudly reported to the German commander about the arrival. As we moved towards the Terek River, strange rumours began to appear. Signs of decay of the Red Army took such proportions that they frightened the communists. Individual units began to surrender to the Germans in their entirety. The Russians faced the threat of a complete moral decay of their troops. There were rumours that armistice talks had begun. There were always rumours of some kind, even about events that had already happened long ago, and all information about them was highly distorted. Churchill paid a visit to Moscow. Somewhere in the mysterious world of diplomacy, some important events were taking place. Our hearts were full of hope. In times of war, people usually perceive all events in extremes, as leading to victory or to defeat. However, everything was now gradually devalued. There was no longer a sincere desire for victory. The absolute power of the dictator, the blatant arrogance of the Nazi Party after victory, it was even scary to think about. But even scarier was the thought of defeat. A soldier at the front is entirely under the impression of the sincere efforts of the hundreds of thousands of courageous men who surround him. The immediate results of the struggle, when you are in the thick of a fighting army engaged in total war, are pushed somewhere further and further beyond the invisible horizon. No one can really foresee all the consequences of war. And in this struggle for existence, the soldier stops thinking and just prefers to follow the course of events. Our unit unloaded from the train in the vicinity of Mozdok, and, to our surprise, immediately came under artillery fire. The Russians could not have been very far away. The head of the railway station, to whom we appealed for explanations, angrily replied, "This is a completely abnormal country, no doubt about it." We crossed the Terek River and went to the flats prepared for us, situated in a settlement a few kilometers south of the river, the name of which I have unfortunately forgotten and cannot now find on any map. We opened a field surgical hospital, but we were deep in the rear besides. Everything was quiet on our section of the front. We didn't have much to do. It was really a completely abnormal country. Even in December the sun rose here at 4 a.m., and by lunchtime, which was at 2:30, it was already completely dark and the stars were shining in the sky. The fact was that the Germans had introduced a uniform time for that part of Europe which they occupied, and there was a difference of 5 astronomical hours between us and Bordeaux. However, the sun and stars could be seen quite rarely, as at this time of the year in this wild corner of the Caucasus everything was usually covered with thick fog. Another extremely unpleasant peculiarity of the area was the abundance of mice, which resembled a biblical flood. Sitting in our houses, we could see 20 to 30 mice scurrying around the room at a time. They ate literally everything. They ate our food. They ate the paper from our cigarettes. At night, they ate the letters left in the pockets of our uniforms, so that in the morning we found only scraps of them. They ran around the operating tables. The kitchen staff waged a constant but completely useless war against them. Nothing else could more graphically illustrate the fact that this world is far from perfect than our helplessness against gangs of these little marauders. We often sat in the evenings in the dark, as candles were very expensive. No one wanted to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning just because it was beginning to get light at that time. No one wanted to go to bed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon just because it was already dark at that time. Despite all its beauty, it was a strange, incomprehensible country with something supernatural going on. Besides, we had no idea how the war was really going on. We couldn't tell from the Wehrmacht reports exactly where the front line was at any given moment. We couldn't even imagine that there wasn't really a solid front line anymore. It was decided that the next day I would go to division headquarters to check with Major Fabricius about the situation at the front, which I did, setting off at 3 o'clock in the morning. That day has remained forever in my memory. No one can claim to really know horses until he has encountered them on the steppe, which is their natural habitat. Here, when a horse raises its head to greet the first rays of the sun with a joyful roar, it is a memory of a distant past that has melted away without a trace. When we left the location of our unit at about 3 a.m., the entire surrounding area was shrouded in thick fog, although it was not cold. The Caucasus is a narrow chain of mountains. As we drove through the foothills, we were only 30 kilometers from their highest. The south wind blowing from the opposite slope brought with it not only fog, but also warm air. Hamidia, where I had hoped to meet Major Fabricius, was only 4 kilometers from our company's position. The little river which flows into the Terek from the south was marked on the map just midway between us and headquarters, and we had to cross to the opposite side of the river. The rivers flowing through the North Caucasian steppes are in no comparison with the rivers flowing in our homeland. Only here we learnt for the first time what a real river is. The Terek Valley is several kilometers wide, and its steep banks are 35 to 50 meters high. Their careful study allows you to make a real excursion into the geological history of the Earth. In calm weather, the valley looks very beautiful. Between the peculiar islands formed by bushes and trees, countless flocks of birds are circling. The river is winding, constantly changing direction. It is so shallow that you can wade through it in many places. The water is the color of light green emerald. In high water its current becomes so violent that it easily demolishes bridges. We often bounced along its banks for many hours, looking for a place to bathe. Besides Garloff, I also took Sergeant Herman on such rides, as he was as good in the saddle as he was at the operating table. The horses had been resting for several days, and we had difficulty in catching them. Their morning impatience, the measured tinkling of the harness, the rhythmic swaying of the saddles, the vapour from their nostrils, the sense of security afforded by the fog that covered the whole neighbourhood, the first reflections of the rising sun, all made one feel that the world was a beautiful place, and that this country was full of mystery, danger, beauty, and hidden power at the same time. Each of us, as we rode on horseback through the pre-dawn gloom, knew that we could rely on our two other travelling companions for everything. A priceless sense of comradeship lived in our hearts, but some subconscious injunction prevented us from expressing it in words. At last it dawned, and we easily found our way to the Tirek. Our horses were at a light gallop. We came to the conclusion that it would be better to head down the Tirek first. Of course, it was a detour, but in this way we could descend from the high bank directly to the river. Then we intended to drive along the river to the place where a small tributary flowed into the Tirek, and then follow it until we reached the ford. This plan, however, failed. The tributary that flowed into the Tirek ran through an impassable swamp. In such a pristine country as this, both horse and rider could easily drown in such a swamp. We travelled back across the steppe, and after a while we found ourselves again at the treacherous rivulet. Although it was not such a difficult trick, we could not descend from the high cliff to the river bank, and had to ride about 5 kilometres more before we found a path by which we could go straight down to the water. The road crumbled under the hooves of our horses, but when we got to the other side, it turned out that this road also led to the steppe. By a fortunate coincidence of circumstances, we should have reached Comidia in an hour and a half. It was already 10 o'clock in the morning, and in another 4 hours it would be dark. As there was still thick cloud cover, we had to orientate ourselves by compass. The horses were at a trot. Clouds of lemmings darted in different directions as our horses approached. Unlike the hamsters, they were brave creatures, which from time to time gather in huge flocks of tens of thousands of individuals and move towards the coast, sometimes covering hundreds of kilometres, and then throw themselves off a cliff into the sea. They were not particularly shy. They would take a few steps to the side, then stop, sit on their hind legs and stare at us with their expressive black eyes until we disappeared from view. A kind of borderline curiosity. Once we scared away a flock of bustards. Like ghosts, these huge birds disappeared into the mist. Suddenly a strong gust of wind came. The fog dispersed, and through its last fragments we saw the outlines of the Caucasus Mountains. The pristine beauty of the world opened up before us as if it had just emerged from the universal chaos. Shining in the sun, the sharp, virgin white peaks were a fantastic, incredible sight against the bottomless blue sky. They resembled a frozen wave as huge as the steppe surrounding them. We were overwhelmed by the sight and splendour of one of the highest mountain systems on earth. In front of such a majestic creation of nature, all human fuss seems as meaningless as lemming migrations. There are times when these animals are seized by some mysterious madness, some unconscious desire for self-destruction, which drives them straight into the sea. Garloff, a very silent man by nature, moved by the sight before him, suddenly pointed with his calloused, chafed hand towards the mountains and say, "All we can do is win the war." I and Fabricius greeted each other quite cordially. We had become firm friends of late. Each of us had plenty of news to tell eagerly. The Major's orderly began to fry a chicken, and we opened a bottle of vodka. It was Fabricius's birthday, and as a surprise the soldiers had built a real bar for the occasion with a counter and high chairs, and it was in this outlandish parody of the Excelsior Palace Hotel that we were seated. We were both in high spirits, and we chatted about everything that goes on under the moon, especially about the crazy world into which we had been born. Soldiers know that happiness is a very short-lived substance, but if you have a moment of happiness, you have to make the most of it before it disappears. But in the meantime, I found out that things are even worse than I thought. Japan had entered the war, and part of the American fleet had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. Were we to our advantage or not? A soldier who knew what American intervention was, from experience of the previous war, would be highly skeptical. Fabricius took out a map and spread it out on the bar counter. In the same way, the two friends could spread out a map somewhere in the Excelsior Palace to decide where to go next. Should we move on to Tiflis or try to meet the Japanese on the veranda of the Grand Hotel in Karachi? Karachi was only about 2,000 kilometers away. Fabricius had never tasted steak in his life. I told him about Tokyo, the city I had visited after the 1923 earthquake. About Kyoto, the old capital of the country, with its magnificent temples filled with treasures of deep antiquity, its enormous number of monks, and the telegraph wires that stretched from one temple roof to another. In Fabricius's map, one could discern strange symbols. I was unfamiliar with the designations adopted by the General Staff. I scrutinized the map for a while Fabricius watched me with an ironic smile. No. Tell me, Fabricius, are these the enemy's positions? Of course, what else could it be? Look here, we're completely surrounded at this point. Could it be that the Russians have closed this narrow passageway? Exactly. Then he explained the situation. Look here. The Russians have moved 5 divisions to the pass lying between Tiflis and Vladikavkaz. Our attack on Vladikavkaz was repulsed. In the north, in the Kalmyk steppe, there were some units left, at least 6 divisions. The Russians moved them across the Caspian Sea to Makhachkala. They even built here in great haste a road that runs along the coast. It is not yet marked on this map. And how are things with us? Yes, we're going to retreat. Why don't they take us to a more convenient line of defence? Fabricius suddenly made a heroic expression and said, "A German soldier will never leave an inch of conquered territory." I see. But surely the army will have to do it. It says, the army alone can't decide anything. We can only control the actions of individual battalions. Then he asked me, Kramus, to what line do you think we should retreat if we act reasonably and in accordance with the rules of warfare? I didn't know the answer to that question. It's this way. He pointed his finger along the Volga. Our troops are already on the Volga. We shouldn't go any further. Fabricius explained to me that the summer offensive had failed. It could be considered a success only if it had been possible to conquer the entire North Caucasus and firmly take it under its control. Stalingrad was not taken. It had to be withdrawn from there immediately. However, in all probability, it was now too late. All army groups south must be withdrawn to the In fact, if the High Command has any courage left, the troops should be withdrawn behind the Dnieper. Only then will we be able to stop the Russian winter offensive. And if we don't, Fabricius looked at me coldly and said, I remembered his phrase word for word, then the party will lose this war. The chicken was already cooked, and our conversation turned to other topics. In the meantime, it was getting dark. I spent the night at the division headquarters. During dinner, the general, who we friendly called His Paternal Excellency, asked me how I felt about going home on leave. Fabricius and I gave him a quick glance. I thanked the general. A week later, I did indeed go on leave. After the meal, the general showed me a gift sabre, which he had been solemnly presented with by the Council of Elders of the Karakai, one of the Caucasian mountain peoples who had declared themselves an ally of Germany. It was a masterpiece forged by one of the masters around the middle of the XVI century. After 3 months on the Kerch Peninsula, I met members of this Council of Elders who were on their way into exile. The rulers of a people who had fought for their freedom for centuries and lost their last hope of it with the departure of the Germans. In this lemming-inhabited steppe, hardly anyone now remembers that these noble men with long beards had established a government of free men. Today there may be only a few of them left alive, languishing in concentration camps in Siberia. This was already the case when the Greeks rejoiced at the tears of the Trojans. Such is the law of life that the victory and glory of some is paid for by the grief and tears of the oppressed and disadvantaged.